Abstract objects would be things like the nature of education, the number 7, classical theism as a philosophical theory, and so on. On what basis do we decide of things, whether they're concrete or whether they're abstract? Or indeed, do we decide on any basis at all? It may be the distinction between concrete and abstract is a brute one, incapable of explication in terms of anything more basic, and we just spot it by intuition. Well, this question is not an easy one to answer by any means, but fortunately for my present purposes, I don't really need to answer it if I can assume, as I think it's safe to assume, that we all have a pretty good grasp on the distinction through the examples I've given, the distinction between concrete and abstract. Okay. Armed then with the distinction between concrete and abstract objects, let's go back to consider the concrete objects that are, let's say, the chairs in this room. It's natural for us to group the chairs in this room together in our minds for the purposes of discussion into one set. I've just done so, and you didn't blanch. The set of chairs in this room. The set of chairs in this room is an abstract object, the members of which are concrete objects. The abstract object, that is the set of chairs in this room, has properties that its concrete members do not have. The abstract object, that is the set of chairs in this room, has this property. It has the property of having a quarter of the number of members, as does the abstract object, that is the set of chair legs in this room, given that every chair in this room has 4 legs. The individual concrete objects that are the chairs in this room could not be said to have a quarter of the number of members as does the set of chair legs in the room. That wouldn't make sense. The individual concrete objects that are the chairs in the room have properties that the abstract object, that is the set of chairs in this room, doesn't have. Each of the concrete objects that are the chairs in this room have, for example, a certain monetary value. They could be bought and sold. The abstract object, that is the set of chairs in this room, could not be said to have a monetary value. It couldn't be bought and sold. Now consider the following 2 sentences. First sentence, the chairs in this room have a certain monetary value. And second sentence, the chairs in this room are 100 in number. Let's suppose that both of these sentences are true. If one wasn't thinking too carefully, one might think that each of these sentences have the same subject, the chairs in this room. The chairs in this room have a certain monetary value. The chairs in this room are 100 in number. Grammatically, it looks that way. So each of the sentences has the same subject and predicates different things of that subject, having a certain monetary value and being 100 in number. But with Frege's help, we can now see that the real subject of these 2 sentences is actually different, despite their similar grammar. The first sentence takes the concrete objects that are the chairs in the room as its subject. The second sentence takes the abstract object, that is the set of chairs in the room, as its subject. The first is saying that the chairs in the room have a certain property, the property of having a certain monetary value. The second is saying that the set of chairs in the room has a certain property, the property of having 100 members. And with this in hand, we now have the tools to understand Frege's interpretation of existence. Consider this sentence. The chairs in this room exist. What is the true subject of that sentence? Is it the concrete objects that are the chairs in the room? No. Is it the abstract object that is the set of chairs in this room? Yes. Saying that the chairs in this room exist is saying that the set of chairs in the room is not the set with 0 members. It's not the empty set. Saying X exists, then, is not actually saying anything about X. It's saying something about the abstract object that is the set of those things that's picked out by the concept of X. And it's saying of it that it's not the set with 0 members. Frege made this point in a catchy way by saying that existence is nothing but denial of the number naught. Well, it's catchy for philosophers. So, according to Kant and Frege, existence is not a property of concrete objects. Existence isn't something that everything does, like breathing, only quieter. Rather, when one says that X exists, one actually asserts something not about X, but about a set of X's. And what one asserts is that the set of X's is not the empty set. The empty set being the set with 0 members. If there's a God, then the set of gods is not the empty set. But the fact that the set of gods will not then be the empty set wouldn't be a fact about God. It wouldn't be a property of the concrete object that was God, that the set of gods was not empty. It would be a property of the abstract object that was the set of gods, the property it had of not being identical to the empty set. So if God exists, it's not actually one of his properties that he exists. It's one of the properties of the abstract object that is the set of gods, but it's not identical with the empty set. So once we've shown, with Kant and Frege's help, that existence is not a property, we can go back to the argument and we can see that premise 2 of the argument collapses. If existence isn't a property, it can't be a property that it's better to have than not to have, so it cannot be better to exist than not to exist. So, to sum up my conclusions with regard to the ontological argument, the first premise is true on both interpretations of it, if and only if theism is true. It's false on the interpretation of it that would be necessary for the argument to be a deductively valid one for theism if theism is false. And that's a sufficient reason for us to conclude the ontological argument is not a good argument for theism. The second premise is false if existence is not a predicate, which it isn't. So that too is a sufficient reason for us to conclude that the ontological argument is not a good argument for theism. So the ontological argument fails in two ways then, which I hope I've given you an indication of. Two ways then as a deductive argument, and starting as it does from pure categories a priori, you'll remember the taxonomy, well, it can't be turned into an inductive argument, so I conclude the ontological argument doesn't provide us with any reasons at all for believing that it's true that there is a God. Have a look at the second bit of the cautionary note. There, the first bit was to do with reformed epistemology and alternative viewpoints there, and as always, everything said from the front is, more or less contested by some philosopher somewhere in the world, and there are some defenders of the ontological argument. I'm not one of them. Give you a moment to read that, and then I'll go on. Okay, turning then to the cosmological argument. That's the second argument I'm going to talk about this week. I'm going to start by reading a presentation of the cosmological argument given by Frederick Copleston in a radio debate with Bertrand Russell. I put a reference on the handout. Here's the argument as Copleston puts it. First of all, I should say, we know that there are at least some beings in the world which do not contain in themselves the reason for their existence. For example, I depend on my parents, and now on the air and on food, and so forth. Now, secondly, the world is simply the real or imagined totality or aggregate of individual objects, none of which contain in themselves the reason for their existence. There isn't any world distinct from the objects which form it, any more than the human race is something apart from its members. Therefore, I should say, since objects and events exist, and since no object of experience contains within itself the reason for its existence, the totality of objects must have a reason external to itself. That reason must be an existent being. Well, this is either in itself the reason for its own existence, or it is not. If it is, well and good. If it's not, then we must proceed further. But if we proceed to infinity in that sense, then there's no explanation of existence at all. So, I should say, in order to explain existence, we must come to a being which contains within itself the reason for its own existence. That is to say, which cannot not exist. Now, there is, I think, it must be confessed, something prima facie plausible about this argument. It seems intuitively obvious that the universe is contingent. Not only might it not have been as it is, but it might not have existed at all. And whenever one comes across something that might not have been as it is or might not have been at all, it seems that we can sensibly ask, why is it as it is, or why is it at all? And that, and this is the principle of sufficient reason, we can expect reality to provide us with an answer, even if epistemically we can't discover it, in all cases. Sometimes the why is it as it is question can be answered by the sorts of investigations undertaken by natural scientists. However, scientific explanations rely on natural laws for which at the most fundamental level there can be no naturalistic explanation. So it seems as if there's something left over at the end of any non-theistic explanation